A friend of mine once told me, the difference between someone with a pizza and someone with a history degree is that the person with the pizza can actually feed their family. Which is why I'm the Red Light Historian. Hello, my name's Michael, and today we're going to be discussing the rise of Pan American Airways and the crash of the Samoan Clipper. And yes, I did buy this red light just for the occasion, although it does appear to be looking a little orange. Anyways, I'm going to begin this video by discussing a lot of the major players involved in the creation of Pan American Airways, with probably the exception of Charles Lindbergh. He's a pretty large figure in American history, and he probably deserves his own video by himself, just so that way we can cover a lot of the details that he's involved with. I'm also going to be referring to Pan American Airways as Pan Am going forward, just to help keep things simple and simplified. Now, without any further ado, let's jump into the video. Igor Sikorsky was a Russian aero engineer born on May 25, 1889 in what was Kiev, Russia. After World War I, he left Russia and emigrated to Connecticut for more opportunities. In Connecticut, he founded an aerospace business which he called Sikorsky Aero Engineering Corporation. Often credited as the father of the helicopter, he created his first model in 1909. However, it would take until 1939 for him to finally get a completed model that would actually fly, which he called the VS-300. However, going back to 1909, his first model was a failure. Because of this, he decided to go back to the drawing board and begin construction of airplanes. It took Sikorsky 2 years to be able to successfully create his first airplane on his 5th attempt. The plane that he created was dubbed the S-5 and held an altitude of roughly 1,500 feet, or 450 meters, and flew for over 1 hour. 2 years later, in 1913, Sikorsky would expand on his S-5 and create the first 4-engine plane, which he called the Grand. This new 4-engine plane was a complete game changer and helped lay the groundwork for many of the models that Sikorsky would come up with going forward, such as the Samoan Clipper, also known as the S-42. Before the S-42 came the S-40, which he developed and released in 1931 and was dubbed the American Clipper. 3 years later, on March 29th, Sikorsky would release his new plane, the S-42, and its larger variant, the S-42B, which is also known as the Samoan Clipper. The S-42 was a 36-passenger flying boat with an aluminum metal body. The plane also boasted a wing load of 28.6 pounds per square foot. Although I'm not entirely positive what that implies, it seems like a saucy factoid to include. Moving on, this boat of the sky had a 2-step hull, allowing it to get more lift out of the water while requiring less horsepower to do so. This plane was an amphibian, meaning it could land or take off on both ground or sea. It did have a landing gear, but it was not always required for the plane to operate properly, depending on the medium the plane was taking off from or landing on. When the plane did descend into water, it was constructed in such a way as to allow 15% of the fuselage to submerge underwater, making landing buttery smooth. Probably. To make all of this plane stuff happen, it relied on the power of 4 559 kW Pratt & Whitney Hornet engines. These bad boys were air-cooled 9-cylinder radial engines that could be found on nearly all of the Sikorsky boat planes. Attached to these engines were controllable pitch propellers created by Hamilton Standard Propeller Company. At the time, newspapers reporting on the S-42 claimed that the flying boat was being built in secrecy in Stratford, Connecticut. However, less than a month later, the Washington, D.C.-based Sunday Star shared details on the plane. The author of the article, Joseph S. Edgerton, shared that the S-42 will be able to carry 32 passengers with a 5-person crew. Edgerton continued, stating that the 19-ton flying boat was twice as large as the naval patrol boats that were in use at the time. Now, the planes created by Sikorsky were considered flying boats, which should not be mistaken for seaplanes. Seaplanes splashed onto the scene in 1911 by American Glenn H. Curtiss. Although many consider flying boats and seaplanes to be the same thing, they do have some differences, such as the way they float in water. Although flying boats and seaplanes are essentially the same thing, the main difference is that seaplanes use floats to float on the water. Flying boats use their actual fuselage to maintain buoyancy while floating in the water. Look who decided to stop and say hello. This is Danny. She's a little cutie. I'm gonna set her down. She seems a little cranky. Love you, Dan. There you go. Be free. Anyways, moving on. Regardless of the nuance, their ability to lug large cargoes and use of different mediums for landing and taking off caught the eye of a man named Juan Trippe. Trippe was a pretty interesting guy, to say the least. He seems to had an interesting background. I saw some articles saying that he might have even been attached to the Skull and Bone Society of Yale. I don't know anything about the Skull and Bone Society. I'm not going to pretend like I do, but just kind of an interesting little factlet about him. But anyways, continuing. Juan was born in Seabright, New Jersey on June 27, 1899 to parents Charles White and Lucy Terry Trippe. Despite his English ancestry, he was named after his great-aunt who hailed from Venezuela and married into the family. In 1909, Trippe had the opportunity to witness Wilbur Wright fly around the Statue of Liberty, lighting a passion within him for all things planes. Later in his life, Juan was able to attend Yale and graduate in 1921. During World War I, Trippe tried to join the Navy in hopes of becoming a fighter pilot. Unfortunately for Trippe, he could not pass the required eye exam, meaning he could not become a fighter pilot. His scores did, however, qualify him to become a night bomber pilot and was set to be stationed in Dunkirk. Despite all of this, Trippe never saw battle as World War I came to a close as he was still en route to Dunkirk. After World War I, Trippe made the decision to return to Yale, where he brought back the university's flight club. Before graduation, he brought back Yale's intercollegiate air meet, which he won. I'm not sure about you, but that does seem a little fishy. After graduation, his father, who was a wealthy Wall Street investment banker, passed away, leaving Juan with a very large inheritance. Juan then used this inheritance, as well as some financing from some of his wealthy friends, to start his first aviation venture, Long Island Airways. At the age of 24, Trippe would buy older or broken down seaplanes from the Navy, fix them up, and use them for a variety of reasons. He would offer rides at Coney Island, do stunts for movies, and even offered a taxi service to resorts around the eastern coast. In 1924, 3 years after graduating from Yale, Juan won America's first airmail contract in the Boston, New York region under his organization, Colonial Air Transport. This airmail contract helped Juan set his sights on a bigger prize, the Caribbean. In 1926, Juan made the decision to leave Colonial Air Transport. He made this decision in the wake of his new desire to expand his business into Florida and Cuba. This idea was shot down by stockholders, pushing Trippe to find new ways to make his dreams come true. Basically, Juan wanted to expand his business from New York to Cuba, but stakeholders told him no. After leaving Colonial Air Transport, Juan and plane builder Tony Fokker flew to Cuba, where Trippe was able to negotiate sole landing rights for his mail service in Havana. Now we are truly getting into the start of Pan Am. This is where everything kind of starts to come together for Juan, as well as some of the other figures that were involved in this business. Pan American Airways Inc. was founded on March 14, 1927 by Henry Arnold, John Jewett, or Ute? I don't know, and J.K. Montgomery. These three men were concerned over a German-owned carrier company that at the time was operating in Colombia called Sociedad Colombo Alemana de Transportes Aéreos, or SCADA for short. And that is what I will be calling it from now on. They saw SCADA as a direct competition and did not want them to expand their influence throughout the rest of the region. On July 16, 1927, the U.S. Post Office awarded Pan American Airways the contract to usher mail from Key West, Florida to Havana, Cuba. However, Pan Am had a problem: Juan Trippe. Juan was the only one that could land in Havana, Cuba at this time. Since Juan Trippe had the sole rights to land in Havana, Cuba, he essentially could force the hand of the other companies that were already vying for control over this mail route. After intense negotiation, Juan Trippe, Pan American Airways, and the now defunct Florida Airways all came together under one business. This new business was called the Atlantic, Gulf, and Caribbean Airways. The name would eventually be changed, however, to Pan American Airways, Inc. In 1929, Pan Am hired a man named Charles Lindbergh. Lindbergh was born in Detroit, Michigan on February 4, 1902, and was an experienced American aviator who on May 20th, in 1927, completed the first solo non-stop flight across the Atlantic from New York City to Paris. Lindbergh was hired by Pan Am as their technical director and helped establish many new routes throughout the Caribbean and into Central and South America. At this point in time, Lindbergh was flying the Sikorsky S-40 and creating many of these routes all by himself. In 1929, Juan Trippe and Igor Sikorsky had reached an agreement where Sikorsky would supply Pan Am with the S-40 seaplanes. Trippe named these seaplanes Clippers, after the 19th century ships that his family built much of their wealth off of. Trippe took this nautical theme in stride and decked these planes out with inlaid mahogany walls and dressed his crew in ocean-liner-esque attire. Each vessel would be christened with a bottle of salt water, which is interesting because planes themselves do not generally appear to be christened, and boats are usually christened with a bottle of champagne. Loren Lehman, who rode on the first passenger flight across the Pacific in 1936, stated, "Clipper is a ship, not a plane. Time is marked by bells. The crew's watches are set at Greenwich Mean Time, and everybody on board moves according to the best merchant marine practice." By 1930, Pan Am became America's longest airline, connecting North America to the Caribbean, Central, and South America. At the time, this was quite impressive. However, on theme with Trippe, who wanted more, he decided to expand his aviation reach throughout America and into Europe. In his quest to expand, things would start to become a little bit more difficult for Trippe. Pan Am ran into the large political wall of England, France, and Portugal, all of whom also wanted to cross the Atlantic. The United Kingdom blocked Pan Am from being able to land in Newfoundland or Ireland, essentially stopping them from being able to cross the Atlantic. These flyover locations were key, allowing planes to be able to refuel or make any necessary repairs from any breakages that may have occurred during the long flight. After intense negotiation, Pan Am and British airline Imperial Airways were able to come to a decision. This decision, however, was more of a consolation prize for Pan Am, as the UK would only allow them to cross the Atlantic if they themselves could cross it as well. This was a pretty large setback for Pan Am since they could not afford to wait for England to catch up. The UK did not have a plane that could cross the Atlantic and would require them to be able to develop one and then create it. From Trippe's initial plan in 1929, it would take them another decade to achieve the goal of crossing the Atlantic in 1939. However, this was merely a setback for Trippe, as he had an even crazier plan in store. If Trippe couldn't conquer the Atlantic, he would just have to conquer the Pacific instead. This plan was nuts. The Pacific is significantly larger than the Atlantic. It has double the amount of water, and there were significantly fewer flyover locations for them to be able to stop at. At the time, the S-40 was the largest U.S. airliner, holding 38 passengers and a 6-person crew. To safely cover this great expanse of water, Pan Am would require numerous bases in which they could safely stop for refueling and servicing their aircrafts. At great cost, Pan Am built bases in San Francisco, Pearl Harbor, Midway Atoll, Wake Island, and Manila Bay. The largest issue for building this route came in the form of Guam. The distance between San Francisco and Honolulu is a little under 2,500 miles. However, the distance between Midway Island and Guam is roughly
2,631.507 miles.
This distance was a concern for Trippe, who began looking for an alternative path to crossing the Pacific. This search led him to an uninhabited island owned by the U.S. since 1899 called Wake Island. This small patch of land was roughly 2,300 miles away from Honolulu and 1,200 miles away from Midway. This small island was also roughly 1,600 miles away from Guam, making it well within reach for Pan Am. From Guam, it would only be another 1,610 miles to Manila, thus completing their Pacific route. However, while trying to complete this route, an old foe reared its ugly head once more. The colonial power of Britain once again attempted to thwart the plans of Pan Am by blocking their ability to land in Hong Kong. To get around this, Pan Am made the decision to land in Macau instead. This decision helped the local economy of Macau flourish. Seeing all of this new economic development, merchants in Hong Kong became distressed and angry, demanding that the governor ignore the demands of Imperial Airways. At this time, Imperial Airways were demanding reciprocal rights to Manila, but as the pressure began to build and 3 years' worth of lobbying from Pan Am, Britain eventually folded and signed a 5-year contract with Pan Am on June 19, 1937. With Britain now out of the way, Tripp had a clear route from America to Shanghai, giving Pan Am more options for crossing the Pacific. With his bases in place, Tripp just had to cross the Pacific in order to make his dreams come true. Unfortunately, the S-40s just weren't going to cut it. Tripp needed something bigger, something that could carry a heavy load and still make the long distance from San Francisco to Manila. This pushed him to go with a new aircraft, the Martin M130, also known as the China Clipper. The M130 was approximately 51,000 pounds with a cruising speed of 157 miles per hour and a range of 3,200 miles. Pushing this plane were 4 Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp radial engines with a Hamilton standard propeller. The plane was fitted with sleeping accommodations, leisure facilities, and even a dining room, on top of normal aircraft seating. It was known as a flying hotel. Altogether, 3 of these planes were built. They were named the China Clipper, Philippine Clipper, and the Hawaiian Clipper. At this point in time, Clippers were recognized for their speed, comfort, and ability to fly long distances. Because of this, many people were drawn to them, such as movie stars and business tycoons. These, however, were also some of the only people that could afford to fly on one of these Clippers. The M130 was delivered to Pan Am on October 19, 1935, with the first scheduled flight set to take place little over a month later. On November 22, 1935, the China Clipper left San Francisco with much fanfare. Many countries even held radio broadcasts of this first flight. This inaugural flight over the Pacific began its journey under the partially completed Bay Bridge and then used the San Francisco waterway to help gain the altitude necessary to fly over the Golden Gate Bridge. The China Clipper was led by Captain Edwin Musick along with his 6-passenger crew. This small group of 7 were given support by 42 others on the ground. Captain Musick stated during the flight, "It is one thing to navigate a service vessel moving a mile every 2 minutes with a wealth of navigational aids at the command of a mariner," and then continued saying, "It is quite another to guide an airliner racing a mile every 24 seconds enshrouded by clouds or above them with endless horizon of open sea below, with the goal even from high altitude visible under best conditions scarcely 20 miles. As the China Clipper approached Pearl Harbor, it was met with 60 U.S. Army and Navy airplanes, giving the Clipper a grand ceremonial entrance as it neared its first destination along its journey. After several days, on November 27th, the Clipper touched down in Guam at 3:07 p.m. That would be 12:07 a.m. EST. It took the Clipper roughly 10 hours and 3 minutes to fly from Wake Island to Guam, which was separated by nearly 1,536 miles of ocean. Once in Guam, the plane unloaded nearly 200 pounds of mail as the captain and crew of the Clipper were joyously met by officials. Overall, it took 6 days for them to reach their destination in Manila. It carried 115,000 letters in its cargo, weighing nearly 2 tons. For a ship to go along this route, it would take them roughly 2 weeks to travel that same distance, but the Clipper was able to do it in half that time. Despite this success, the China Clipper did start out on rocky shores. It was roughly a year late in delivery, causing Tripp to have to come up with a plan B. So as not to be set back, Tripp continued to plan his routes by using the Sikorsky S-42 flying boats that he had at his disposal. Unfortunately for Tripp, these planes were meant for the Atlantic and did not have the fuel range necessary to cover the long distances between the stops of the Pacific. But again, Tripp wouldn't let this discourage him. He pushed ahead with his survey expedition, using a stripped-down S-42. To help give the S-42 the necessary fuel range to fly these long distances, Tripp had the passenger accommodations completely removed from the planes. It was actually just one plane. I don't know why I added an S on that. Please forgive me. This meant that where the passenger cabins once were, Tripp had an auxiliary fuel tank installed instead. This refab of the plane allowed it an overall flight time of 21.5 hours with a total flight range of 3,000 miles. April 16, 1935 marked the first survey flight from San Francisco to Hawaii, which was also led by Captain Edwin Musick. The plane left the San Fran Bay at 3:50 p.m. after roughly a 30-second takeoff run. This first flight carried 2 tons of mechanical and engineering equipment, roughly 10,000 letters worth of postage, and about 150 pounds of mail. Overall, this was the 12th successful flight of any airplane to fly from California to Hawaii. After this flight, Captain Musick and his crew then made a successful return home on April 22nd. As a side note, Fred Noonan was the navigator on this 1935 expedition with Ed Musick. Noonan would later go on to fly with Amelia Earhart, where he would also disappear. Moving on, these survey trips continued throughout the summer, gradually pushing the S-42 across the Pacific until it reached Guam in October of 1935. At this point, Pan Am began using its M-130 boat planes. On October 21, 1936, Pan Am finally flew its first paying customers from San Francisco to Manila. This flight was also captained by Ed Musick. Captain Edward Charles Musick, nicknamed Ed, was born in St. Louis, Missouri on August 13, 1894. At the age of 9, he and his family moved to California, where he was able to attend the 1910 Great Air Meet. This experience would help to establish the love Musick held for aviation, leading him to attend flying courses at the age of 19 in 1913. After the courses, he served as a pilot for numerous airlines, as well as a civilian pilot instructor during World War I. Upon leaving the military, Musick began working for Pan Airways Incorporated in 1921. In 1922, while working for the company, Musick flew to an island in Bahamas named Little Abasco. There he flew physicians back to mainland America who were on the island so as to save the life of Lottie Russell. Mrs. Russell was the wife to Roy Russell, who was the manager of the Bahama Islands Importing and Exporting Corporation. This shows that even at a young age and early in his career, Musick was trusted by those who knew him and employed him. 5 years later, after racking up numerous accomplishments, Musick was hired as a test pilot by the fledgling Pan Am Company in October of 1927. On the 28th of the same month, Edwin made Pan Am's inaugural mail flight as he carried 4 tons worth of packages from Key West, Florida to Havana, Cuba in a Fokker tri-motor airplane. By 1930, Musick was promoted to the position of chief pilot for Pan Am's Caribbean division. During his illustrious career, Edwin Musick was one of the first pilots to fly over 10,000 hours in the air, as well as travel over 1 million miles and set 10 world records for aviation. For a portion of his career, he held the most recognized records out of any pilot worldwide, many of which he took from his European counterparts. He managed to accomplish all of these feats, all without performing any flying stunts, something he held in high regard for himself. This extensive airtime led Musick to achieve the Harmon Trophy for Aviator of the Year award in 1935. Up to this point, only 2 other Americans had earned this prestigious award. The other 2 American winners of this award were Wiley Post, as well as fellow Pan Am alumni Charles Lindbergh. During his time at Samoan Airways, many of Ed's co-workers would jokingly refer to him as Cautious Ed. An article published in a newspaper on January 28, 1938 echoed the same sentiment. The Worcester Democrat featured a couple who was referred to as Mr. and Mrs. Conquest. The Conquest family recalled one of Edwin's flights which displayed this cautious side of Musick. On February 13, 1927, Music was flying across the east coast of America when he encountered a snowstorm. Seeing the storm growing into a blizzard, Music made the decision to land his plane in an open field. Because of this decision, all potential damage was completely avoided, as the plane crew and passengers were all safely taken to the ground in an open field near Atlantic, Virginia. This wise decision from Ed may have come from a previous incident that occurred on April 24, 1922. At this time, the boat plane Santa Maria went missing in the Caribbean. The flying boat left the Key West and was making its way to Nassau, but never arrived at its destination. The Santa Maria had a crew of 6, with one of the pilots being Ed. After multiple days of frantic searching, the Santa Maria and its crew were found alive and well, roughly 200 miles east of the Key West at William Island. Upon recovery, the crew stated that they ran into a strong wind. This wind caused the Santa Maria to use up most of its fuel, forcing the plane to make a rough landing. Unfortunately for the plane, despite the safe landing, they didn't have any form of communication, meaning they were completely stranded on the island. Luckily, on April 26, the Santa Maria was spotted by a naval plane under the command of Albert C. Reed. Thankfully, due to the smart decision-making of the crew, the hard work of Commander Reed and his men, as well as a bit of luck, the Santa Maria was able to continue to soar the skies. As evidenced by his track record, Ed Music was an exceptional pilot and one of the top pilots of his day. Music's stellar career is what allowed him the opportunity to make many firsts in pilot history. In 1938, Ed was primed for another one, as he and his crew set off across the Pacific to deliver mail to Auckland, New Zealand. Unfortunately for Ed and his crew, this flight would be very different from what he experienced in 1922. On March 11, 1937, New Zealand made the independent decision to allow Pan Am to fly to its shores, breaking away from both Australia and the UK. For over a year, Ed had been gearing up for this new destination as he officially made the move to the Pacific coast in April of 1935. On March 17, 1937, Music would officially depart San Francisco for Honolulu. By March 29, 1937, Music had completed the first survey flight to Auckland, New Zealand from San Francisco, California. At this point, the plane being used was a slightly larger version of the S-42, the S-42B. What sets the S-42B apart from its S-42 counterpart is its enlarged capacity to carry fuel as well as a larger facility for the crew. These changes allowed the S-42B to go longer distances than the S-42, and therefore explore new routes for Pan Am to travel. There were other variants of the S-42, such as the S-42A, but overall, only 10 planes were actually made, all of which were exclusively sold to Pan Am. The particular plane flown by Music that day was called the Pan American Clipper II. This plane would go on to carry several different names and fly several different routes throughout its career. It would also not be the final time Music would fly this specific aircraft. After the 1937 survey flight, the plane would go on to fly between Manila and Hong Kong as a shuttle airliner. While doing so, it would be called the Hong Kong Clipper. After building its resume, Pan Am decided to use this plane for its first official mail-carrying flight back to Auckland. Due to the new region the plane would be flying, the plane was once again renamed and dubbed the Samoan Clipper. December 23, 1937 marked the reunion between Ed Music and the newly dubbed Samoan Clipper as the plane left from Pearl City, Oahu to Auckland, New Zealand. It took 12 hours and 52 minutes for the Samoan Clipper to reach Pago Pago, which is the capital of American Samoa. The flight was a length of 1,806 miles, slightly shorter than their next flight to Kingman Reef, which was 1,561 miles. After this, the crew would only have 1,085 miles left to reach Honolulu and be back on American shores. The Clipper would eventually land in Hawaii on January 3, 1938, successfully delivering the mail it was carrying. After a short 6-day reprieve, the Samoan Clipper and her crew would depart Hawaii once again for the difficult venture back to Auckland. The crew of this plane consisted of 6 other men besides the 48-year-old Ed Music, who is captain of the Samoan Clipper, the others being First Officer Cecil G. Sellers, Junior Flight Officer Paul S. Brunk, Navigator Fred G. McLean, Engineering Officer John W. Stickrod, Assistant Engineering Officer Jack A. Brooks, and Radio Officer Tom J. Finley. Initially, everything was going very smooth for the Samoan Clipper, as it was shuttling its 900-pound cargo across the Pacific. Eventually, the Clipper found its way to the small mountainous harbor of Pago Pago. On January 11, 1938, at 5:38 a.m. Pago time, Captain Music and his crew took to the skies once again as it began its final leg to Auckland. However, only 38 minutes later, things would begin to take a drastic turn for the Samoan Clipper. At this time, Music made the report that one of his 4 engines had sprung an oil leak. This turn of events caused Music to decide to turn the boat plane around and return to Pago Pago. It would be another 2 hours before Pan Am would hear from Music, the next report coming from the Clipper stating that they were planning to dump their excess fuel so as to lower their overall weight. At this point, the Clipper had not made it back to Pago Pago. At 7:55 a.m., the plane was spotted above Apia on the island of Opalu, which was roughly 75 miles west of Pago Pago. It seemed weird at the time for there to have been a 2-hour radio silence from the Clipper when they were not that far off from Pago Pago. Some people believe the plane may have landed in open sea so as to make any necessary repairs to the Clipper, although others have pointed to the lack of communication facilities in the western side of the Samoan Islands as the cause for the lack of radio reporting from the plane. They felt the plane was most likely in the ocean, or potentially being taxied a long distance. Much of this belief stemmed from an incorrect report stating the plane was seen floating in the ocean 74 miles west of Apia. However, despite this 2-hour gap, Pan Am officials were not overly concerned. This 2-hour gap and lack of communication could have easily been caused by weird atmospheric conditions in the Southeast Sea. These conditions could potentially cause the radio of the Samoan Clipper to not be heard by nearby radio outposts. Regardless, this was the final communication Pan Am would receive from Captain Music and his crew of the Samoan Clipper. Many at this point were placing their hopes in Music and his outstanding record, having flown nearly 1.5 million miles with no serious issues to show for it. Fuel dumping was also not necessarily unheard of. At the time, only planes carrying passengers had regulations regarding fuel dumping, meaning it was perfectly fine for the Samoan Clipper to do so. As previously stated, the harbor of Pago Pago was not only small but practically encircled in mountains. Music felt it was necessary to dump the excess fuel so as to have a light enough plane to safely land in the dangerous harbor. In addition to this, it was also believed that the Clipper was only 3 minutes away from Pago Pago when Music made this decision to lighten the plane. Despite being only a few minutes away, it took several hours for the Navy to be notified of the potential crash. Pan Am made the independent decision to wait to notify the Navy, which would be to give Music ample time to return home and not make any hasty decisions. Fishermen local to the area noticed smoke rising from the northwest section of the island. The U.S. Navy dispatched a plane from their base in Tutuila Island who was able to find an oil slick in the ocean. Upon finding this oil slick, the Navy then sent out a minesweeper called the USS Avasay. The first day of the search did not turn up anything for the USS Avasay. However, the search began once more at dawn the next day. But this new day also brought new information, as the USS Avasay managed to find some oil in the ocean about 12 miles off the coast of Pago Pago. Upon returning, the minesweeper brought with it bits of plane as well as other objects, presumably from the Samoan Clipper. The parts themselves were charred and covered in aluminum powder, suggesting that the Clipper experienced an internal explosion, causing it to be engulfed in flames as it crashed into the water. In addition to burned up plane parts, a tie clasp belonging to the Assistant Engineer Officer J. A. Brooks was also found. Based on this wreckage, as well as the waters being infested with sharks, no hope was ever given towards finding any bodies of the lost in the crash. Upon finding these belongings, as well as the burned up bits of plane, the USS Avasay realized that they would not find any survivors amongst the wreckage. This was especially heartbreaking since Brooks transferred onto the Samoan Clipper flight. He was originally scheduled for a different flight, but due to Christmas, chose to transfer onto the Samoan Clipper to allow him to stay home with his family over the holidays. An investigation into the crash ensued, both internally and externally. The crash quickly became international news, pushing the Assistant Secretary of the Commerce Department, J. Monroe Johnson, to discuss the matter with news outlets. In August of 1938, a source close to Pan Am revealed that government officials were inspecting the possibility that sabotage was taking place in the machine shops associated with the Clipper. In addition to this, government officials also double-checked the charts of both the mechanics and inspectors who had worked on the Clipper. Over the course of their investigation, they discovered an eyewitness who saw the plane crash. A woman living in Tutuila witnessed the giant Clipper attempting to glide into the port of Pongo Pongo as if going in for landing. However, she stated that the plane crashed into a ball of flames once the large craft touched water. The investigation determined that the Samoan Clipper unfortunately experienced a catastrophic explosion due to the ignition of the fuel the plane was dumping. Fuel dumping is a relatively common occurrence for planes who are trying to lighten their overall weight. This is because most airplanes have a maximum takeoff and landing weight. If the planes were to experience a major problem shortly after takeoff, the captain may choose to release gasoline so as to help reach the required landing weight. The same sentiment was echoed by Tripp himself. In an article written in January of 1938, it writes that Tripp stated that fuel dumping before a landing was a conservative and normal practice. Pan Am had also already took fuel dumping into consideration as it had tested this feature using dye. These tests found that when the S-42 dumps fuel, the fluid tended to accumulate around the trailing edge of the wings. This was caused by the airflow patterns that occurred around the wings, which could also cause the accumulated fuel to get sucked back into the wings. This was an even larger issue due to the position of the wings above the cockpit. Essentially, this meant that as the S-42 dumped fuel, wind pushed some of the liquid back into the wings. As the vapors built up, it could find its way into the cabin and cockpit, both of which were loaded with necessary electrical equipment. As the fuel came into contact with the electrical equipment, it caused the gas to spark and ignite, essentially transforming the plane into a bomb. This was at least one of the going theories at the time. Others speculated that the gas could have come into contact with the hot engine exhaust or potentially the electrical motors that controlled the wing flaps. Regardless of the exact reason, both independent investigations operated by the US Navy and Pan Am came to the conclusion that the plane caught fire due to the fuel dump and exploded in the Pacific Ocean. To this day, the exact cause of the crash, as well as the resting place of the Samoan Clipper and her crew, are still a mystery. At the time, divers as well as vessels designed for combing the ocean were considered to help uncover more information about the final moments of the Samoan Clipper. However, after further exploration of the location, it was found that the plane crashed in upwards of 1,000 fathoms of water. Neither Pan Am or the US Navy had the necessary technology to be able to investigate the Samoan Clipper crash. Although this revelation likely gave some peace to the families of the crew who were left behind, it was still not easy for them in the wake of this catastrophic event. On January 12, 1938, the Washington Times wrote that Mrs. Music, wife of Ed, was pale, but still in control of herself as she learned the news of her missing husband. Mrs. Marion McLean, the wife of Navigation Officer F.J. McLean, sat by her phone waiting for any update on her husband. Attempting to maintain a sense of normalcy, she had still put both of her young daughters to bed at an early hour without missing a beat. Friends of junior flight officers P.S. Brunk were waiting for news of the accident in Berkeley, California, where Brunk had previously been a police officer before joining Pan Am. Unfortunately, better news would never come. In the wake of the crash, things would change. Although Pan Am stated that they had no intention of stopping their flights across the Pacific, the way they would conduct these flights certainly did. A newspaper article published in 1941 by I.R. Hagel stated that the crash of the Samoan Clipper prompted the Air Safety Board to abolish fuel dumping. A government report from 1976 regarding fuel dumping for military and civilian aircrafts stated that fuel discharging was legal. It did specify the legality was dependent on emergency situations as well as the location in which you could dump said fuel. However, despite these regulations, I did not see anything suggesting an outright abolition of fuel dumping in general. Regardless, the article written by Hagel still suggests that the world had a different view of aviation. and people were publicly discussing ways to make flying safer. In 2014, a paper was published by several notable figures outlining the identification for potential targets to be researched in the Pacific Ocean. The authors of this paper were aviation historian Lonnie Shore, maritime archaeologist Dr. James Delgado, and the president and co-founder of Air Sea Heritage Foundation. The paper was presented at a workshop held by NOAA and the Ocean Exploration Trust. The outcome of this paper was a newfound desire to locate the lost Samoan Clipper. In 2019, a conglomerate of groups came together to form the first search expedition to find the lost Clipper. From July 14th through the 20th, the exploration vessel, known as the Nautilus, headed by the Air Sea Heritage Foundation and Search Inc., began their search throughout the Pacific for the plane. The plan moving forward was to utilize a remotely operated vehicle attached with a side-scan sonar system to help scan the area where the Samoan Clipper crashed. However, despite these best-laid plans, the Samoan Clipper was still unable to be found. Today, we can look back at the accident and view it in a different perspective. Of course, it is still a tragedy, but it also displays our potential to keep moving forward despite any setback. In 1940, the crash of the Samoan Clipper ranked in the top 25 aviation accidents of all time. But they weren't alone, as 4 other S-42Bs crashed as well. In fact, today there are no known surviving S-42Bs in any private or public collection. For this reason, it is important for us to continue our search and continue moving forward, not only for the sake of progress, but for the sake of remembering our past as well. Thankfully, we do have several memorial locations for the Samoan Clipper. One such memorial being the Music Memorial radio station located in Auckland, New Zealand. Maybe someday, we will be able to find the Clipper and allow its crew to return to light once more. So my overall analysis on the Samoan Clipper is that I think the outcome is kind of obvious. As shown in some of the information, of the 10 S-42Bs that were built, 5 of them crashed. When you reconfigure a plane as many times as they were reconfiguring them, mistakes are bound to be made. And if they're not put together perfectly, anything could happen. I mean, look at the Boeings that are going on today. That's, don't play around with them. On top of that, they already knew about the fueling problem. So they already knew there was a cause for concern. It just seemed like a recipe for disaster. Plus, you're pushing these planes beyond what they were designed for. They were initially designed to take on the Atlantic, not the Pacific. So they had to reconfigure them in order to allow that to happen. I just think if you change the design enough, mixed with the already inherent problems of the plane, you're just dealing with a ticking time bomb, which, I mean, they have a 50% ratio of death. So I just think it was stupid, frankly. I don't know why they were doing that. Well, I mean, I do know why, but they wanted to make money. And it caused change, but regulations written in blood, and unfortunately in this situation, the blood was Ed Music, who seemed to be a pretty stellar pilot, all things considered. So it's a very unfortunate situation that he had to go through this in order to make those changes. I think it was avoidable, but I don't know how much Tripp actually cared, if I'm being honest with you. He seemed to have a little bit of anti-labor ideologies, and especially anti-communist ideologies, which communism and the labor movement kind of went hand in hand. He also helped put down some labor protests that were going on. Like he helped Ford out with in Fordlandia during the uprising. He allowed Ford to be able to use some of his planes to fly in Brazilian mercenaries in order to help quell the uprising that was happening in Fordlandia. If you don't know anything about that, actually I think Wendigoon put out a really good video on it, so I would strongly consider checking that out. I will link it in the description for you guys. Tripp also appeared to probably have some connections with the CIA. I know he helped try to stop the spread of communism in China by helping spread anti-communist propaganda. So he just seemed like he cared more about making money than he did about his employees, based on what I could tell. But I don't know. Hello, Future Michael here. It's taken me a minute to really edit this video. I had no idea what I was doing, but I just thought there was a little bit more to the analysis that I could add, so I thought I would fill that in before I publish the video. What I really wanted to touch on was also that this was kind of a unique situation going on in the world where Pan Am was kind of fighting with the colonial power of Britain at the time, as we mentioned, as I mentioned with Shanghai, while Pan Am was trying to get the authority to be able to land in Shanghai, and the Shanghai merchants were having a fit and telling the government to ignore British rule. That kind of showed that there was a sort of a taken power where Pan Am was slowly chipping away at the colonial imperialist authority that Britain held at that time. I thought that was kind of important, so I thought I should add that. I also wanted to say that I've never edited before. This is my first time, so I apologize that it's kind of choppy. As well as the audio is not particularly great. I'm working on that. I'm trying out a few different things. So over the next few videos that I put out, I'm gonna play with the formula a little bit, see if I can make it a little bit better. Add a little bit of sound barriers and things like that, just to make it, a little damper, not so echoey. Also, I'm trying out a little mic here. See if that picks up on anything, my voice a little bit better. See if that helps out with the quality at all. But overall, I would like to thank everyone who did take the time to watch this video. If there's any suggestions or comments you have on ways that we can improve, or any ideas on content going forward, I would love to hear them in the comments. And thank you very much. And the rest is history.